In the early days of June 2024, Kenya found itself on the edge of a storm brewed not by nature, but by the simmering frustration of a generation. Young Kenyans, facing rising costs and economic uncertainty, began to push back against a proposed finance bill that threatened to redefine what it meant to survive in their own country. What started as digital whispers on social media quickly grew into a roar heard from Nairobi's streets to the corridors of power. This was not a protest driven by political parties or old alliances. It was a movement born of social media, powered by youth, and fueled by a shared conviction that they deserved a say in their fate. When tens of thousands of young people spilled into the streets, the government responded with force, and what followed would test the very soul of the nation. To fully understand why the protests erupted with such power, we must rewind to the months leading up to June 2024. Kenya was already a nation under economic pressure. Families were battling high prices of food and fuel, businesses were drowning in taxes and loan interest, and young graduates walked the streets with CVs that rarely led to job opportunities. There was a growing disconnect between the promises made by leaders and the reality lived by citizens. The Finance Bill 2024 arrived in this environment like a storm cloud. On paper, it was a revenue-raising plan meant to pull the government out of financial distress. Kenya's national debt had ballooned dramatically over the years, and the government argued that new taxes were necessary to stabilize the economy. But to ordinary Kenyans, the bill felt like a direct attack on survival. One of the most emotional triggers was the proposed tax on bread. Bread is not just another food item. It is a symbol of the Kenyan household. Families rely on it for breakfast, students buy it because it's affordable, and workers grab it when they can't afford full meals. The idea that even this basic item could become more expensive infuriated many. The bill also introduced a controversial motor vehicle circulation tax, which threatened to push transport costs higher. For millions of Kenyans who depend on matatus, bodabodas, and taxis, this meant yet another rise in daily expenses. Business owners feared they would be forced to pass the extra cost onto consumers, making life even harder. Then came the youth's greatest flashpoint: the government's move to increase taxes on digital services and mobile transactions. To young people, this wasn't just taxation, it was an attack on their lifeline. Many ran small online businesses, sold products through social media, used ride-hailing apps for work, or depended on mobile money for day-to-day survival. They saw this as the government squeezing the only platforms that offered them a chance. Beyond the new taxes, what hurt the most was the feeling of disrespect. Many Kenyans felt that the government was spending recklessly, borrowing excessively, and failing to cut wasteful expenditures, yet turning to citizens to fill the financial gap. Reports of luxurious government travel, inflated budgets, and questionable contracts frustrated young people who felt their leaders were living extravagantly at their expense. And then there was the emotional blow, the suggestion that the tax authorities could gain deeper access into people's bank and mobile money records. This awakened fears of state overreach, financial vulnerability, and the erosion of privacy. Suddenly, the finance bill didn't just seem like a tax document. It felt like a symbol of a government getting too powerful, too intrusive, and too detached. Every conversation, whether online, in matatus, in university cafeterias, or in homes, seemed to come back to the same question. Why are ordinary people being punished for problems they did not create? Many felt that corruption, not citizens, was the true reason for the nation's financial crisis. They argued that before taxing bread, the state should seal the leaks in public spending. This climate of anger, betrayal, and desperation laid the foundation for what happened next. The country was a pressure cooker waiting for the final push. And when the finance bill was announced, that push finally came. It was no longer just about numbers in a budget. It was about dignity. It was about being heard. It was about a generation refusing to stay silent anymore. As the finance bill continued to gain attention, something remarkable began to happen. Something that had never taken place on this scale in Kenya's political landscape. Young people, especially those under 30, started to take charge of the national conversation. They didn't wait for seasoned activists, political parties, or civil society groups. Instead, they built a movement from scratch using the one tool they understood better than anyone else: social media. What makes June 2024 unforgettable is not only the protests themselves but how they formed. It started quietly. A few Kenyans on X, formerly Twitter, began to break down sections of the finance bill in simple language, explaining what each tax meant for everyday life. They did what many leaders had failed to do: communicate with honesty and clarity. These early posts spread quickly, gaining thousands of shares. Soon, influencers, content creators, university students, and young professionals joined the conversation. Hashtags emerged, and within days, what had started as casual online commentary turned into a powerful digital movement. The most striking part was that the movement had no official leader. No single person stood at the front giving orders. Instead, ordinary citizens, many of whom had never been involved in activism, began posting videos, analyzing budget details, interviewing experts on live streams, and encouraging others to read the bill for themselves. It was the birth of a leaderless revolution, where every participant became a voice in the fight. Unlike past protests that relied heavily on political organizations or unions, this one grew through humor, creativity, and bold digital energy. TikTok videos mocked the bill with satirical skits. Others used clever animations to explain tax changes. Memes spread faster than government statements, and young people shared live commentary late into the night. There were even parody songs and remixes capturing the mood of the nation. But it wasn't just entertainment. Behind the humor was genuine pain. Pain over high costs, joblessness, and a sense of being ignored. Gen Z had always been criticized for being soft or disinterested. Yet in this moment, they displayed a level of organization and discipline that shocked the country. They didn't wait for someone to give them permission. Instead, they created their own space, mobilized their own peers, and built a digital structure stronger than any traditional political machinery. Online, young people coordinated everything, from fundraising for injured protesters to sharing legal advice about dealing with arrests. Anonymous volunteers created protest posters, coordinated medics, and designed safety guides in case police used tear gas or rubber bullets. On-the-ground organizers used group chats and live streams to update the public in real time, helping people know which roads were safe, where police were stationed, and where help was needed. It was a revolution of smartphones. Live streams captured thousands of viewers. Videos posted from the streets were instantly shared, creating a feedback loop that kept the protests alive. Every moment, every chant, every confrontation was broadcast to millions. The Kenyan youth embraced this moment with a level of unity rarely seen before. They came from all tribes, religions, and regions. They weren't divided by political affiliation or past grievances. What united them was simple: a shared frustration with the cost of living, a belief that leaders were out of touch, and a fear that their future was being eroded by decisions made without their input. Even more powerful was the fact that many of them had grown up in a digital world. They knew how to research issues, debunk false information, and educate one another quickly. When misleading details about the protests were shared online, young creators responded with facts. They corrected narratives, shared verified information, and refused to be manipulated by political propaganda. And although the protests started as online outrage, it wasn't long before the youth decided to take their voices offline and onto the streets. Calls for peaceful demonstrations began circulating on social media, and young people responded in overwhelming numbers. They planned their first major march. The date was set. The posters were shared widely. The message was clear. This was not a violent protest. This was a peaceful stand by a generation demanding accountability. And when the day finally came, Kenya woke up to something it had not seen in decades: thousands of young people marching. Not because a politician had mobilized them, but because they had mobilized themselves. What started as a few posts on social media grew into a nationwide movement that would soon shake the country's political landscape and expose the deep fractures between the leadership and the youth. The stage was set for some of the largest demonstrations Kenya had witnessed in years. By mid-June, the momentum that had built online began to explode into reality. On June 18, 2024, thousands of young Kenyans, driven by anger, hope, and a resolve to be heard, gathered in Nairobi's central business district. What had started as digital activism had now become a full-scale street protest. Their destination, Parliament. Their demand, the finance bill must go. From early in the morning, protesters began converging around Parliament buildings and along Kenyatta Avenue. Many came clad in black or in plain clothes, holding hand-painted placards, flags, and banners. The energy was raw but disciplined. These were not seasoned political operatives. These were young people, many of them first-time protesters, yet united in their call for dignity and fairness. Tension in the air was almost immediate. Police, already mobilized, were not welcoming. Nairobi's regional police commander publicly stated that no protest permit had been granted. Authorities insisted that the gathering was illegal, even as the Kenyan constitution guarantees the right to peaceful assembly. The crowd, however, pressed on. Their message was simple, yet powerful: drop the bill. As the hours ticked by, the cracks began to show. Tear gas canisters were launched into the crowd. Smoke curled through the streets, mixing with the shouts of young people demanding to be heard. Some demonstrators tried to regroup. Others fled momentarily, only to return with renewed determination. As the tear gas drifted closer to the Parliament building, protesters started throwing stones. Others tried to protect themselves, pulling scarves over their faces, coughing, but still chanting. Vehicles parked around Parliament were not spared. Windows shattered, some cars damaged. As the intensity of the confrontation escalated, reporters on the ground described a scene of chaos. Live coverage, gas masks, people carrying friends bruised or choking, ambulance helpers trying to tend to those suffering in the smoke. It was also a day of mass arrests. Dozens, reports say over 200, were detained. Lawyers, human rights observers, and even journalists who had come to cover the protest found themselves caught up in the dragnet. Some were arrested on the spot, others whisked away in police vans. Many were shocked. They had come peacefully, expecting to make a statement, not to be arrested for simply standing up for their rights. Despite the heavy-handed response, the protesters refused to be cowed. Their presence wasn't just symbolic. It was a strategic act of civil disobedience. Even as live gas filled the air and arrests multiplied, more people rallied. Citizens linked hands, sang, shouted, and pressed on toward Parliament. Their courage was contagious. In response to the public outcry and mounting pressure, Parliament made sudden concessions. By that same day, key tax proposals were rolled back. The government announced the withdrawal of the 16% VAT on bread and other contentious levies on motor vehicles, financial services, and mobile money were being reconsidered. But for many, this felt like too little, too late. The rollback stirred mixed reactions. Some saw it as a victory, while others insisted that partial amendments were not enough. They demanded a full withdrawal, a complete rejection of the finance bill. Yet even as amendments were being made, the protests only grew louder and more confident. The youth realized that their strength lay not only in numbers but in their refusal to back down. They were not satisfied with tweaks. They wanted systemic change. At the same time, civil society organizations and legal advocates joined the fray. Lawyers moved to defend those arrested. Human rights groups began documenting arrests, abuse, and the use of force. A mass of social media posts went up, calling for solidarity, sharing legal advice, and coordinating medical support medics, first aid kits, safe meeting points. Across Nairobi and in other cities, including Mombasa, Kisumu, Eldoret, the protests were spreading. The youth-led movement was no longer confined to the capital. It was rapidly becoming a nationwide phenomenon. In each city, the same script played out. Peaceful marches, chants, digital live streams, and increasingly, confrontation with police. But in Nairobi, the stakes felt especially high. The physical proximity to power, the walls of Parliament, the gates that lawmakers passed through daily, meant that every act of protest felt personal and symbolic. For the youth, storming the corridors of power was not just a metaphor. It was a message. We are watching. We are here. We refuse to be ignored. As dusk settled on that first major protest day, the city buzzed with more than anger. It pulsed with something more dangerous to the powers that be. Hope. Hope that change was possible, and that young Kenyans, mobilized and united, could force their leaders to listen. This was not the end. It was just the beginning. The first protest had set the tone, resolute, loud, and uncompromising. What would follow in the coming days would test both the strength of the movement and the willingness of the state to respond with anything less than force. As the days passed, the protests that began as peaceful marches began to take on a different tone. The government's initial response, tear gas, water cannons, and mass arrests, had not intimidated the youth. Instead, it had strengthened their resolve. What the authorities failed to understand was that Gen Z was fighting for dignity, survival, and a future they felt was slipping away. Every canister fired, every arrest made, only poured petrol on an already blazing fire. By June 20th, the protests had grown into a nationwide phenomenon. Nairobi, Mombasa, Nakuru, Kisumu, Eldoret, Nairobi, Kakamega, Meru, almost every major town had been swept into the movement. Young people marched with their phones held high, live streaming every moment, documenting every act of police aggression and every display of courage. Their content, raw, emotional, and unfiltered, spread like wildfire across social media, pulling more Kenyans into the streets. The government's response hardened. Riot police were deployed in larger numbers. Barriers were erected around Parliament, State House, and strategic points in the city. Nairobi's central district became a fortress. But fences could not contain the rising power of a generation determined to break through. The turning point, the moment that would change the course of the protests forever, came on June 25th, the day Parliament was scheduled to vote on the finance bill. The air was thick with tension from morning. Long before the vote, protesters poured into Nairobi's streets in overwhelming numbers. By noon, crowds stretched for blocks, a sea of young faces shouting, singing, chanting, "Reject the bill! We are the people! Cost of living must fall!" Police fired tear gas early, attempting to scatter the crowds before they reached Parliament Road. But this time, the youth didn't break. They pressed forward through the white clouds, using water bottles, wet towels, and each other to keep moving. Medics, most of them volunteers, ran toward the injured instead of away from danger. Every time the police pushed, the protesters reorganized and surged again. Then came the moment that shocked the nation. As lawmakers inside Parliament debated the bill, protesters outside broke through the final police barricade. For the first time in Kenya's modern history, a crowd of unarmed civilians stormed into the precincts of Parliament itself, a symbol of authority that had stood untouchable for decades. Footage from that day shows young Kenyans climbing over barriers, pushing through gates, waving flags, and chanting defiantly as they poured into the grounds. Inside the chambers, MPs panicked. Some attempted to flee, others hid. Sirens wailed across the compound as police reinforcements rushed in. Tear gas filled the air, smoke drifted into corridors, and chaos reigned both inside and outside the building. The government's grip on control seemed to loosen by the minute. But the storming of Parliament came at a devastating cost. Security forces escalated to extreme measures. In several parts of the city, including the CBD, Ngara, Mathar, Githurai, and downtown streets, live bullets were used. The sound of gunfire echoed between buildings, and panic spread. Protesters ran in every direction, some taking cover behind cars, others shielding injured friends. It was no longer just a protest, it was survival. Ambulances raced in and out of the city center, overloaded with the wounded. Hospitals became overwhelmed within hours. Videos surfacing online showed young men and women bleeding on pavements, carried by strangers they had never met but who refused to leave them behind. The brutality jolted the entire nation. Families began to flood police stations and hospitals searching for missing loved ones. Some discovered that their relatives had been arrested. Others were told that their children had been taken to morgues. Reports of abductions emerged, young activists snatched at night by masked men, driven away in unmarked vehicles. Kenya was experiencing something it hadn't felt in years. Fear mixed with outrage. Despite the heavy casualties, despite the arrests and disappearances, the youth refused to be silenced. That night, as the city tried to absorb what had happened, online spaces exploded with grief, fury, and determination. Names of the dead circulated widely. Faces of the injured appeared on timelines. Fundraisers were launched, legal teams mobilized, missing person posters shared. The message was clear. You may stop us with force, but you cannot silence a generation. While Parliament passed the finance bill in the chaos, the government's victory was hollow. The storming of Parliament had marked a symbolic breaking point. Gen Z had shown that they were not a passive generation. They were willing to risk everything, even their lives, to fight for a country they believed in. In the days that followed, Kenya was shaken to its core. Conversations shifted from taxes to a deeper, more painful question. How did a peaceful protest end with so many young Kenyans killed? And what would happen next? The battle over the finance bill had become a national crisis, one that would force the government to make decisions that would surprise the entire country. When the tear gas finally settled and the smoke around Parliament began to clear, Kenya entered a period of grief and disbelief. What had started as a youth-driven protest movement had turned into one of the deadliest civilian tragedies in recent Kenyan history. Dozens of young Kenyans were confirmed dead, hundreds were wounded, and many more had gone missing in the chaos. Families across the country, in Nairobi, Nakuru, Kisumu, Eldoret, Mombasa, and smaller towns, found themselves searching hospitals, morgues, and police stations, desperate for answers. Funerals began almost immediately. Entire communities gathered to mourn sons and daughters who had marched not for personal gain, but for a better country. The grief felt national. Kenya had lost not just individuals but voices, young people who believed in their right to question power and shape their future. Human rights groups released detailed statements describing excessive force, unlawful detentions, and cases of people being taken away by security forces and never seen again. Some survivors shared harrowing stories of being held in secret locations, interrogated, and threatened. These accounts only deepened public anger and intensified the demand for justice. Under immense pressure from the public, the president addressed the nation. In a significant reversal, he announced that he would not sign the finance bill and promised to withdraw it entirely. It was a major political concession, a recognition that the people had spoken loudly and at a tremendous cost. He expressed condolences to the families of those killed and promised a national dialogue that would include youth leaders, civil society, religious groups, and professional bodies. To show commitment, he announced a series of budget cuts within government, a reduction of executive spending, cuts on foreign travel, and a review of government programs. Supporters viewed these changes as a step toward responsibility and transparency. Critics, however, felt the gestures were not enough, arguing that without real accountability and systemic reform, the promises would fade over time. Meanwhile, the demand for justice grew louder. Families wanted answers. Activists insisted that investigations into the killings, disappearances, and injuries must be thorough and independent. Many argued that accountability should reach beyond the officers on the ground and include the senior officials who authorized the response. Questions began to emerge about who gave the orders, who coordinated the crackdown, and whether the state would be willing to hold its own institutions accountable. International organizations joined the conversation, urging Kenya to address the violations and ensure justice for the victims. Domestically, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority faced pressure to investigate every death. Critics worried that without strong political will, meaningful accountability would be difficult to achieve. Economically, Kenya now faced a different crisis. With the finance bill withdrawn, the government still needed to find ways to manage debt, raise revenue, and balance the national budget. Officials began discussing spending reviews, austerity measures, and alternative approaches. Analysts warned that removing the bill created significant fiscal pressure, but many citizens felt that economic challenges could not justify the loss of lives. In the midst of these debates, something profound had changed in the country. Young people realized the power of their united voice. They had influenced national policy, forced the government to retreat, and shaped the political conversation. Even as they mourned, many began to organize, calling for continued activism, government accountability, and long-term reform. Yet the biggest question lingered. Would the sacrifices made be honored through real change? Without prosecutions, without reforms, and without recognition of the violations that occurred, many feared the tragedy would be remembered but not resolved. As the days passed, Kenya stood at a delicate crossroads. On one side lay grief, anger, and the demand for justice. On the other lay promises of reform, new dialogue, and a chance to rebuild trust. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The youth had transformed the political landscape, and Kenya would never again underestimate their power. In the weeks that followed the withdrawal of the finance bill, Kenya experienced something deeper than political tension. It experienced an awakening. The protests, though born out of frustration with a single law, had ignited a consciousness that was far larger than anyone had anticipated. A new generation, once written off as apathetic or distracted by social media, was now recognized as the country's most powerful political force. For years, Gen Z had been dismissed as a digital generation, creative, outspoken online, yet supposedly uninterested in traditional civic engagement. But the protests shattered that stereotype. Suddenly, young Kenyans were emerging as community organizers, human rights defenders, legal researchers, volunteer medics, and social commentators. In their grief and anger, they rediscovered something Kenya had been losing: the belief that citizens could still shape their own nation. Online spaces evolved into powerful civic tools. Twitter Spaces became nightly town halls where thousands gathered to analyze events, expose injustices, share eyewitness testimonies, and discuss constitutional rights. TikTok and Instagram, once filled primarily with entertainment, turned into platforms of resistance where youths documented abuses and educated each other on legal processes, budget policies, and government accountability. It was as if an entire generation woke up to its purpose all at once. At the same time, the protests reshaped the relationship between young people and the institutions that governed them. They realized that the problems they were facing, unemployment, debt, rising taxes, corruption, poor governance, and the escalating cost of living, could no longer be blamed on distant forces. They needed to demand answers directly from those in power. Many of them began studying how government works, how bills are written, how budgets are drafted, and how public offices operate. In a matter of weeks, the youth had become some of the most politically informed citizens in the country. Community networks that began during the protests did not dissolve. Instead, they multiplied. Medics who had treated injured protesters built coordinated emergency response groups. Volunteer lawyers formed coalitions to track abductions, secure release orders, and gather evidence for future legal action. Content creators developed online platforms dedicated to explaining governance, civic rights, and economic issues in simple, relatable language. What had started as spontaneous activism was slowly becoming organized power. Parents, teachers, religious leaders, and older citizens watched with a mixture of pride and fear. They were proud that their children were courageous enough to confront injustice. But they were afraid of the price the youth had already paid, and the unknown risks ahead. Many families, still traumatized by the violence, urged the youth to be cautious. Yet deep inside, they understood something important. Kenya needed this awakening. For the first time in a long while, the government had been forced to listen to voices it had ignored for years. Politicians also began to adjust. Some reached out to young organizers, hoping to align with their momentum. Others retreated, avoiding the public eye and the anger that still simmered. A few tried to discredit the movement, claiming it was influenced by foreign donors or manipulated by unknown forces. But these narratives failed to gain traction. Kenyans had watched the youth take to the streets with their own eyes. They knew the truth: the revolution was homegrown. Meanwhile, within government institutions, a quiet introspection began. Some security officers privately admitted that the crackdown had gone too far. Civil servants acknowledged that the communication gap between officials and the public had fueled mistrust. A number of lawmakers who had previously voted without scrutiny now found themselves under intense pressure from constituents demanding transparency and accountability. The protests had also awakened something unexpected: unity across tribes, classes, and backgrounds. For years, political divisions had been shaped along ethnic lines, but the youth rejected that narrative entirely. In the streets, Kikuyu marched beside Luo, Kamba beside Kalenjin, Leah beside Somali. The national flag became the only identity that mattered. The unity displayed during the protests was unlike anything Kenya had seen in decades, perhaps since independence. For the first time, the youth were showing the country what nationalism looked like when it wasn't tied to political loyalty, but to shared struggle. Yet the biggest shift was internal, within the hearts of the youth themselves. For many, the protests became a moment of self-realization. They understood that they were not powerless. They understood that government was not an untouchable entity. They understood that change was not something to wait for, but something to fight for. And they understood that their voices, when united, could shake the foundations of power. Still, they carried the trauma of the losses. Every name of a fallen protester became a symbol of the price they had paid. Every injured victim became a reminder of what was at stake. Every abducted activist represented the dangerous line between courage and sacrifice. These memories did not weaken them. They strengthened their resolve to push for a better Kenya. And so, as July approached, Kenya was living in a new era. One shaped not by political elites, but by the courage of young citizens who refused to look away. A generation had risen, carrying both pain and purpose. The protests had ended, but the movement had only begun. In the aftermath of the June protests, Kenya entered a period of intense scrutiny. The nation was no longer just grieving. It was demanding answers. Citizens, activists, journalists, and civil society organizations pressed for accountability at every level, from the frontline officers to the highest offices of government. The question on everyone's lips was clear. Who would pay for the lives lost, the injuries sustained, and the enforced disappearances? The Independent Policing Oversight Authority, IPOA, and the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights became central figures in this unfolding drama. They were tasked with investigating allegations of excessive force, arbitrary arrests, and disappearances. Yet, despite the weight of public expectation, progress was slow. Families of the deceased grew impatient as bureaucratic delays and political maneuvering slowed investigations. Activists accused authorities of protecting officers and commanders who had issued orders during the crackdown, deepening public mistrust. The national debate was heated and often polarized. Some argued that the state had acted in defense of law and order, claiming that the protests had turned violent and threatened infrastructure, public safety, and parliament itself. Others countered that the violence had been largely one-sided, pointing to videos showing unarmed young people being shot, beaten, or arrested en masse. Citizens questioned whether defending the bill justified the deaths and injuries of peaceful protesters. The discussion was no longer only about taxation. It had become a moral reckoning about state power, civic rights, and justice. Social media remained a key battleground. Youth-led organizations, survivors of the protests, and citizen journalists flooded timelines with first-hand accounts of abuse, photos of injuries, and stories of families torn apart. Online campaigns demanded prosecutions, transparency, and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Hashtags calling for justice trended nationally and even gained attention internationally, putting additional pressure on the government to act decisively. Parliament faced its own crisis of credibility. While the finance bill had been withdrawn, the handling of the protests and the subsequent deaths became a political liability. Opposition members used the tragedy to challenge the government, demanding inquiries and threatening motions of no confidence in key officials. Even within the ruling party, debates emerged about whether leaders had underestimated the youth, mismanaged security forces, and misread the political landscape. The bill might have been halted, but the question of responsibility for bloodshed remained unresolved. Meanwhile, communities affected by the protests began to organize independently. Families of the victims formed coalitions demanding formal apologies, reparations, and memorials for the deceased. Lawyers volunteered to assist survivors in filing lawsuits against security agencies. Grassroots campaigns aimed at documenting and preserving the stories of those who suffered became a civic duty, ensuring that the events of June 2024 would not be forgotten. The protests also sparked discussions about long-term reform. Citizens questioned whether Kenya needed systemic changes in policing, legislative oversight, and civic engagement. Should officers be trained differently? Should there be stricter accountability measures for command decisions? How could young people be meaningfully included in policy discussions before laws were passed? These questions dominated newspapers, radio programs, and televised debates, creating a national conversation that went far beyond the finance bill itself. International observers monitored the situation closely. Human rights groups, diplomatic missions, and advocacy organizations called for independent investigations. Kenya's reputation was at stake. Foreign investors, development partners, and multilateral organizations expressed concern over the use of force and the potential for continued unrest, highlighting that accountability was not just a moral issue but an economic and political one as well. Despite the delays and frustrations, one undeniable fact had emerged. Kenya's youth had permanently shifted the balance of power. Their actions had forced the government to retreat, had challenged entrenched systems, and had proven that citizens could not be ignored. While the question of justice remained unresolved for many, the protests had awakened the nation to the reality that accountability, transparency, and civic engagement were no longer optional. By the end of this period, Kenya found itself in a tense equilibrium. The government had survived politically, but legitimacy had been shaken. The youth had proven their power, but their losses weighed heavily on the nation. Across communities, schools, and workplaces, people debated the events of June 2024, asking what lessons could be learned, how governance could improve, and whether the country could prevent such tragedies in the future. The protests had ended physically, but their social, political, and emotional echoes were far from over. In the months following the deadly June 2024 protests, Kenya began to feel the ripple effects of what had occurred. The streets were quieter, but the conversation had shifted permanently. Across the nation, citizens were no longer willing to accept decisions handed down without scrutiny. The youth had demonstrated that numbers, courage, and persistence could change the course of government action, and that lesson would not be forgotten. One of the most immediate effects was political. While the finance bill itself had been withdrawn, the government realized it could no longer pass legislation without meaningful engagement with civil society and youth representatives. Policy proposals began to be accompanied by public consultations, town hall meetings, and online debates to gauge public sentiment. Ministers and officials understood that ignoring the voice of young citizens could have consequences far more serious than protests. It could threaten legitimacy, trust, and stability. Societal changes were equally profound. The protests had united people across ethnic, religious, and economic divides. Kenya's youth discovered that they could overcome traditional social and political barriers when faced with shared challenges. In schools, universities, and workplaces, discussions about civic responsibility and governance became more common. Young Kenyans who had once felt powerless now actively participated in local decision-making, community service projects, and advocacy initiatives. New youth movements emerged from the ashes of the protests. Some focused on civic education, teaching peers about constitutional rights, how to engage with government, and the importance of voting and advocacy. Others focused on economic empowerment, helping young people start small businesses, access digital platforms, and create financial resilience, recognizing that economic vulnerability had fueled much of the anger that led to the protests. Volunteer groups, inspired by the emergency response teams during the protests, became permanent networks for first aid, disaster relief, and community support. The tragic losses were commemorated nationally. Memorials were set up in Nairobi and other major cities to honor those who had died. Every year, June became a day of remembrance, reflection, and civic education, a reminder of the sacrifices made and the importance of accountability. Families of victims were supported through advocacy funds, scholarships, and community initiatives to preserve the legacy of their loved ones. Institutionally, the government took some steps toward reform. Security agencies were pressured to adopt stricter rules of engagement, increase accountability, and improve training for handling large-scale demonstrations. Parliamentary committees introduced mechanisms for better oversight of police actions, and debates about civil liberties became more robust. While challenges remained, these changes reflected a clear acknowledgement that the events of June 2024 had exposed vulnerabilities in governance that could no longer be ignored. Perhaps the most lasting impact was the shift in youth consciousness. The June protests had shown that when young people organized, communicated, and stood united, they could demand real change. They had learned that digital tools could amplify their voices, that civic education was power, and that solidarity across communities could overcome even the most entrenched obstacles. This realization transformed a generation, one that would continue to influence political, social, and economic life in Kenya for years to come. The protests also left a more subtle but no less important mark on national identity. For many Kenyans, the events of June 2024 became a symbol of resilience, courage, and the struggle for justice. Citizens began to ask harder questions of their leaders, demand transparency, and engage in conversations about fairness, equality, and representation. The protests had shifted the balance of power in a moral and societal sense. Authority could no longer act without scrutiny, and the people, particularly the youth, had proven that they could hold it accountable. In the end, while the June 2024 protests were born out of anger, desperation, and frustration, their legacy was one of empowerment, awareness, and reform. Kenya had faced its darkest moments, but from that darkness emerged a generation that refused to be silenced, a society more vigilant and united, and a nation reminded that change is possible when courage meets conviction. As the dust of June 2024 settled across Kenya, the country entered a period of profound reflection. Newspapers, television programs, and social media were filled with debates about what had happened, why it had happened, and what it meant for the nation's future. Citizens asked difficult questions. How had a single finance bill sparked such widespread unrest? Why had the authorities responded with lethal force? Could Kenya prevent similar tragedies in the future? For many, the lessons were clear. Governments cannot govern in isolation. Policy decisions, particularly those that directly affect citizens' livelihoods, must be accompanied by meaningful consultation, transparency, and clear communication. The protests had shown that ignoring the voices of the people, especially the youth, comes at a tremendous cost, not only in lives lost but in trust and legitimacy. Leaders learned, sometimes painfully, that accountability is not optional. It is essential for a functioning democracy. Communities also reflected on the power of unity. The protests had crossed tribal, religious, and economic boundaries. Ordinary citizens realized that solidarity could overcome long-standing divisions. Across the country, people began to recognize that shared struggles required collective action, dialogue, and mutual support. Civil society groups, once small and localized, grew into nationwide networks committed to civic education, advocacy, and youth empowerment. Kenya had witnessed what happens when ordinary citizens refuse to be passive observers, and the message was unforgettable. For the youth, the lessons went even deeper. Many had seen friends injured, abducted, or killed. They had confronted police brutality, arbitrary arrests, and political intimidation. Yet, despite the danger, they learned that courage and organization could influence national decisions. They understood the importance of digital literacy, the role of social media in civic engagement, and the necessity of strategic planning in protest movements. Perhaps most importantly, they realized that hope could be transformed into tangible action. They were no longer bystanders in the country's political and social future. They were active participants shaping its direction. The government, too, faced a reckoning. Public trust had been shaken, and officials recognized that rebuilding legitimacy required more than promises. It demanded structural reforms, accountability for past abuses, and a genuine willingness to engage with citizens. Security agencies were urged to adopt stricter protocols, reduce excessive force, and improve dialogue with communities. Parliamentarians were reminded that legislation disconnected from the people's needs could ignite unrest with devastating consequences. Amid the grief and anger, however, there was also hope. Memorials for the fallen were erected, scholarships and community programs honored the sacrifices of the deceased, and nationwide campaigns began to educate citizens about civic responsibility, governance, and constitutional rights. Kenya's youth, empowered by the events of June 2024, continued to organize, advocate, and innovate, ensuring that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. Ultimately, the June protests became more than a response to a finance bill. They became a defining moment in Kenya's modern history. They were a testament to the resilience, courage, and determination of ordinary citizens who refused to be ignored. They reminded the nation that progress comes with struggle, that change requires sacrifice, and that the voices of the people, when united, can shape the destiny of a country. As Kenya moved forward, the echoes of June 2024 lingered, a constant reminder that the future belonged to those willing to fight for it, that justice required vigilance, and that hope, even in the darkest moments, could be transformed into meaningful action. The protests had ended, but the spirit they ignited, a spirit of courage, unity, and accountability, would continue to guide the nation for years to come. As the year unfolded, the impact of the June 2024 protests continued to reverberate across Kenya. The nation had been forever changed, not only in politics, but in the way citizens, particularly the youth, perceived their power and responsibility. What began as a fight against a single finance bill had become a movement that reshaped the social contract between the government and its people. One of the most significant transformations was the newfound respect for youth participation in governance. Politicians could no longer dismiss young voices as irrelevant or uninformed. Their influence was undeniable. They had forced the withdrawal of legislation, drawn national attention to systemic injustices, and mobilized communities across ethnic, regional, and economic divides. The youth had proven that their vision and courage could challenge entrenched power structures and inspire a countrywide awakening. In government circles, the protests sparked reflection and gradual reform. Security agencies implemented stricter rules of engagement, emphasizing de-escalation over brute force. Parliamentary committees introduced measures to increase oversight of law enforcement, ensuring that the tragic events of June 2024 would not be repeated without accountability. Ministries and public offices began prioritizing citizen engagement, holding forums, consultations, and online discussions before policy implementation. The finance bill protests had demonstrated that governance without consent was no longer sustainable. At the societal level, the protests became a symbol of unity and resilience. Communities that had once been divided along tribal, economic, or religious lines came together in solidarity during those critical days. This unity, born from shared struggle and shared sacrifice, inspired longer-term cooperation in civic, educational, and economic initiatives. Young people who had organized medical aid, legal support, and protest coordination continued to build networks that strengthened local communities, creating lasting institutions of civic engagement. The human cost, however, remained at the forefront of public consciousness. Memorials, scholarships, and programs honoring those who had lost their lives were established in cities across the country. Families of the deceased and injured found support through advocacy and community initiatives, while their stories became a national reminder of the stakes involved when citizens fight for justice. Every life lost was a testament to the courage required to demand change, and every injury or disappearance highlighted the price of challenging entrenched power. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the awakening of a generation. The youth who had risked everything understood their power, their voice, and their role as guardians of the nation's future. They had learned that activism, when informed, organized, and united, could force accountability, reform, and dialogue. They had seen that courage could transform anger into meaningful change, and that even the most entrenched structures of authority could be challenged when the people stood together. Kenya had entered a new chapter. While the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The June 2024 protests had left an indelible mark on the nation's history. They had exposed weaknesses, highlighted injustices, and demanded reform. They had demonstrated the strength, intelligence, and courage of a generation ready to take responsibility for the country they would inherit. And most importantly, they had proven that in Kenya, change was not just possible. It was inevitable when people refused to remain silent. As the country reflected on the events of that fateful June, the message was clear. The sacrifices made would not be forgotten. The lessons learned would guide future leaders, and the youth who had risen to demand justice would forever be remembered as the generation that dared to hold power accountable, reshaping Kenya for the better. And that's the full story of the June 2024 finance bill protests in Kenya, a movement that shook the nation, cost lives, but ultimately showed the power of unity and the courage of Kenya's youth. If you found this story powerful or eye-opening, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth stories from Kenya and around the world. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Thank you for watching, and remember, knowledge is power, and every voice matters.